Let's make sure that this follows suit. So sheet 1. Okay, cool. So I should have my laser cut sheets out there. Let's open Grasshopper now, and what we're going to do is we're going to learn how to map our surfaces to each of these points and annotate them in the same stroke. So to do that, when we open up Grasshopper, let's sort of break these out so we can see them side by side. Okay, so the model space of Grasshopper, hopefully you're becoming familiar with. So as we move, let's double click on the model space and bring in surface containers. So this is going to relate all of our surfaces. And so what I've done is I've right clicked, select multiple surfaces, and then selected my surfaces. The next thing we need is our points. So I'm typing in, double clicking in the command line and finding points. I'm going to right click and I'm going to set multiple points. So the order that we select these points in is important because it tells the computer basically how to organize how to map our sheets. So if I want this to be my first one, I can go 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. And as I click, you can see that Grasshopper is tracking my the point order that I'm selecting them in. I can select multiple points. Now, the multiple points, this depends on how the file itself was created. So Rhino in general will default when you array something, it will privilege the x-axis first and then the y. So for example, if I were to select all of these points along this line, you see how it moves along the rows and then goes back. So I don't want to do that. I want to be able to select, I want it to go by column. So I'm going to select multiple points. So first column, second column, and so on. So make sure that these are correct. Now, rows are fine. I'm using columns because I find it easier to organize when I start trying to pack material in together by organize things by column. But again, this is up to you. Rows or columns will work. So as I'm selecting these, I'm thinking about where I'm going to, in the end, have to look for places to sort of move. So for what I mean by this is, right now we're giving it a uniform distribution of points, but our shape is not a uniform shape. That there are some pieces that are smaller and some pieces that are bigger. So I'm going to have to go in manually at the end of this to move my point grid around in order to accommodate and pack as many pieces as I can on the smallest amount of sheets to save material. Okay, so I'll get my point grid in. So I have my surfaces, I have my points. Before we sort of move any further, let's sort of make sure that our surfaces are correct. So on my surfaces, I want to move things, I want to select a point on a surface. So we can do this two ways. We can do this with area. So what an area will do is it will give you the geometric center for a surface. And then let's do a point list. So this tells us the order of items in this. So you'll notice I can't plug a surface into a point. So let's do this in. And let's look. Okay, so my first surface is the top, and my last surface is the bottom. So in this case, I don't want that. I want the reverse to be true. So I can right-click and reverse my list. Okay, so now what we can see is this list of surfaces starts from the bottom and moves to the top. That looks fantastic. All right, so here we are with our points. We have the order is in the right way. It's going to start on sheet 1 and progress by column through each of these things. And we're going to right click and do move. So this is eventually where we're going. So what are we moving? Well, we're going to move each one of these surfaces. And it needs a translation vector. So in this case, we're going to use a vector 2-point. So our first point is going to be from our center, and our second point is going to be from our grid of points. You'll notice, however, that these lists are different sizes, so that's a problem. They need to be the exact same size. So in order to do that, we're going to compare lists through a shortest list. Shortest list will compare the two of these, take the shortest of the two, and that number, and it will then trim the longer to match the shorter. So in this case, what happens is if I plug in my surfaces and my points here, it's going to trim my surfaces. So I have more surfaces than I have points. So I'll show you what happens when this is the case. So if I plug this in, so what happens is at the end, the last 28 surfaces get mapped to the last point. So this is a problem because I need to have, I can't have two surfaces in the same spot. So in order to do this, I have to let's go into my top view. So, okay. So let's edit. So here under properties, I should be able to change its name, or its, let's see if I double click it. There it is. Okay, sheet. I think this is sheet 11. Okay. 12. Sheet 13. Okay. So values, nothing in it. Select multiple points. There we go. Okay. So the manage point collection, I can't seem to get working in an efficient way right now. So we're going to use this way. Feel free to sort of play around with it and see if you can get it to work appropriately. So I'm going by column here. Now, because I'm annotating and getting my point order right, this is sort of what takes the time. But once I have this mapped out, it makes it really easy to edit and to change or to iterate my work. So I'm spending a little bit of time in the front end making sure that this is correct, and the idea is that in the long run you will save time. Okay. And increase accuracy. That is the idea. All right, so how's it working now? So it appears as if we got it to work. All right, so let's hit Control Spacebar to disable or to disable the preview. All right, perfect. So we have our files mapped out. So we moved our objects. Now the next thing we need to do is count. So let's annotate. So we're going to do text 3D. This places a text object at a location. So our location is going to be our point grid that has been our shortened point grid. And now we need to tell it what to write at each of those points. In order to do that, I'm going to make a count function, which is called series. So series generates, tells the computer how to count. So it asks for a start number, a step, how large is each count. So is it every one? Is it every integer, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Is it odd or is it even, 2, 4, 6, 8? Or is it like a real number, such as like a 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, etc. So in this case, I want to count to the same number of items I have. In this case, it's 128. So let's do 128. And I want to start it. By default, it starts at 0. I'm going to start at 1. And I'm going to plug this tag in. And it looks like we have our first number here is 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And our last number here is 128. Okay, so that looks perfect. All of my pieces are annotated now. If we look a little further at this function, we can see that we can change the size. In this case, I can change the size in inches. So I can make it small. Say I want it to be a ½ an inch tall. Okay, great. So I'm looking for any possible issues with conflicts. So it is possible that the center of your point is also a hole. So we'll go into moving it here in a second. Okay, so the next bit is your color. We don't need to worry about that. And text justification. So if you right click on this, there's a series of selections which allow you to change how or where the text object is in relation to that point. So if we do center, okay, that works here. I don't have any issues. Or do I? Let's just sort of make sure. So typically a good rule of thumb is to check your smallest pieces and your largest pieces, or pieces with possible holes. So we have a possibility of problem here. It wouldn't make it unlegible. So why don't I just move it to bottom center. Okay. There's another way of moving the location of these points. So if instead we do this, and we can move this point, why don't we give it, we can move it, let's move it to along the x-axis. So if I do x, and I'm going to give myself a little more room, so I'm going to hold Alt and then sort of expand this out. Okay, so there we go. Plug this in. Okay, and I'm going to give myself a, so say I want to give it a range. So in my keyboard, what I can say is, I want to select numbers within a range so I can move them around. So I could say -1 inch is less than the number I want it to start on. So let's say -0.5, and then the largest number in the range, which is 1 inch. So let's zoom in here, plug this in, and we can see that I can go from 1 to -1. and it's moving along the x-axis. So that's one way of moving your points. Now it's doing so globally. So each point moves the same amount. If you don't want it to move in the x and you would prefer it to move in the y, you can also do that. Okay. So again, you can move it above or below that point. All right, let's go back to the x. And let's move it out. So let's just make sure that we're not interfering anywhere. Okay, looks clear. Looks clear. Okay, so that's really nice. So as I'm looking at my objects, why don't I, so I can sort of start to hide, so control space to hide my objects. So these are surfaces, and I want to make my surfaces curves. Now this is a little more refined. I can do this manually, of course, but just to show you some more Grasshopper workflows. So why don't we hide this guy. Now I want to, if I type in deconstruct a brep, under surfaces I can find this here. So I go analysis, deconstruct a brep. Now what a brep is like a surface or surface-like object. It could be surfaces, it could be polysurfaces, it could be complicated geometries, but it will break these objects down into bases as a list, edges as a list, and vertices as a list. So surfaces, curves, and points is another way of saying this. So why don't we sort of hide this? All I want from this is my edges, are my edges. So I type in curves, and I just want to get my list of curves. So I pull out my edges to my curves, and there they are. So these are my laid out laser cut files. So before I bake these into the proper geometries or bake them back into Grasshopper, I just want to sort of make sure that everything is packed as tightly as I can get it. So as we see, there's sort of a lot of room between my objects. And this is because I didn't do a very thorough job in the beginning of laying out my point grid. So the better my point grid is in the beginning, the less I have to do this at this stage. So there is, if you are interested, there is a way of scripting this so you can tell Grasshopper to fit these objects onto a sheet, and that's a little more advanced, but if you're interested, we can work that out. Okay, so let's see, can we see if we can stack 2. That would be great. So on some of these we're going to be able to stack 2, on others we're not going to be able to stack, because we have some pieces that are bigger than others, of course. Okay. So let's keep moving these over. So you'll notice that all I'm doing is moving points, and the rest of these geometries are following. So that makes a really sort of useful way of gaining control and making associative geometries. So let's sort of get these like this. Okay. So here these are. Okay, so so you get the idea of sort of how this works. So just make sure that you have a little bit of margins and you don't have any overlapping pieces. Now each of these, so each of my pieces has a curve to cut and a name. So let's just sort of make sure that these are in the right spot. Okay, so I'm going to obviously I can become much more efficient at laying these out. Okay, so once I sort of have them laid out right, let's put them back into Rhino. So in order to do that, I right click and I do bake. Now what bake allows me to do is it allows me to tell Rhino which layer I want to send these objects to, whether or not I want to name them, whether or not I want to display them in certain ways, or most importantly, whether or not I want to group them or not. So in this case, if I group them, all of these objects would become one group. So no, I don't need to do that. Okay. And then tags. So bake, and then I want to send this to score. I say okay. And then if I close Grasshopper, there's my laser cut file. Thank you so much for watching, and please let me know if you have any questions.